So we're going to start right off. I do want to just say up front that each of these people have tremendous backgrounds. They have videos online. And the first question, I'm going to just sort of have them introduce themselves or what they're working on for 30 seconds, but we could go, of course, on for all of these people. But that also goes for all of you in the audience. Each of you are here for a reason, and we could sit here and have a conversation with any of you. So I think I speak for all of us. I know I speak for Kristen thinking about this, and Tim. I mean, we would have a great conversation with any of you up here, and so we do hope you'll participate, and we're really honored to be with you all. So the question that we were going to start with today is really the question and the prompt for the panel. The panel, as you saw on the agenda, is sort of what can we learn from global perspectives, and obviously U.S.-centric, and as Tim said, that's by design. That's the nature of the Brooks Institute. But we are, I think, as the United States, a believer that we're kind of an exporter of all things good when it comes to animals and other things, of course, and exceptional. But the first question that we were going to discuss, and I was going to turn it over to everyone here to be able to say a word about themselves and sort of start this conversation, is just what do you think is going well either in your work as an academic or in your region of the world? What are some things that you're proud of and that we might, here in the U.S. or in Canada or the U.K. or wherever you are, learn something from? And so maybe I will start. If you probably saw the introduction, but I'll just say that the 6 panelists we have, I think they're all projected, or maybe they'll project when they're on, but I guess that's, so the people you can't see yet, but that I can see on very fancy monitors here are Anna Peters, Monica Nunez-Salas, Lynn White, and then on the stage with me we have Gladys Kamasanyu and Jaya Nagali. And so I will just go across maybe start online since the people in the room can't yet see you until you speak. But Anna, do you want to start with maybe just telling us for 30 seconds what you're doing, and then, like I said, maybe answering this idea of what do you think that people in this room, who I know you know and wish that you could be here with, could learn from what's happening either in your work or in your region of the world?
Yes, my name is Anne Peters. I'm a director at the Max Planck Institute for Public International Law in Heidelberg, and I work on global animal law, so I'm a scholar. And I think that it's an interesting experience is in the European Union. There is, in the Treaty on the European Union, an animal welfare mainstreaming clause, which says that since animals are sentient beings, all policies made by the European institutions and also by the member states when they implement the policies must pay full regard to animal welfare requirements, while respecting, however, giving attention to religious rights, cultural traditions, and regional heritage. And this mainstreaming clause has been employed recently more proactively by the Court of the European Union, which uses this clause to interpret European Union law in a more animal-friendly way. For example, in a recent decision, it allowed Belgium to ban unstunned slaughter and prescribe electronarcosis for slaughtering by relying on this clause. So I think that such type of, one could say, constitutional law for the European Union has some beneficial effects through the courts.
Thank you so much. Monica Nunez, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can go ahead. Thank you. My name is Monica Nunez. I am from Peru. I'm assistant professor of environmental law at Universidad del Pacífico, and I research in conservation, comparative law, and sustainability of Chinese investments abroad. So I think the main, and this is probably the position that I'm going to represent more during this panel today, is I feel like the main lesson to learn is not necessarily only from the US looking at the rest of the world, but just generally the West or the Western conception of animal law and rights of nature that we have, I think, can very much be enriched and learn a lot from the indigenous communities' biocentric perception of the agency of nature, the agency of animals, and the inherent respect and like mutualism and share of resources that we have. I think the perspective that this top-down perspective that Western law sometimes contributes to, contributes or grants or concedes to animals by recognizing that they have rights, is sometimes constraining to the actual welfare and well-being and conservation of not only animals, but the ecosystem at a large on which we all depend. So I hope we can exchange some ideas on that exchange of ideas that is happening currently, I think, between the Western notion of rights of animals and the traditional indigenous notions that we, each of us, see in our countries and in our work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Lynn, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Justin, and it's great to be with you. I'm the Director of Strategy at Animals Australia. My background is law enforcement, 20 years policing in Australia. When I moved to the animal protection movement, I have spent a considerable amount of that time on investigations across 3 continents following our global live animal export trade. I've also worked in the media on behalf of my organisation and done considerable political lobbying, both in my country and others. I think in terms of what is going well, I would suggest that concern about the welfare of animals across all systems in Australia is higher than it's ever been before. What's not going so well is that has not resulted in regulatory change as governments still prioritise the interests of industry over what the people want. I think, media has been invaluable to us in terms of alliances with journalists who see the deep injustice in the issues that we're working on. I think that where we're looking at creating reform in terms of this regulatory paralysis is, and I can't say a great deal today because it's not being launched as yet, but there will be a new alliance announced between groups in Australia shortly, which will be calling on the appointment of animal welfare ministers and also an independent commission for animal welfare, so that we bring some independence into review processes, which truly are glacially slow in our country. We believe independence is what is needed to get science recognised and also the will of the people. Like the US, probably our most significant advancements in reforms have come through the retail sector, where you find people that are aligned in their views in terms of concern about animal welfare, but of course there is some leverage there too in terms of them understanding their brand risk. So I think Australia in many ways reflects the US, and I think independence in our area is a key to ensuring that the concerns of the people are actually implemented into regulatory reform.
Thank you, Lynn. Gladys, do you want to take a minute, introduce yourself, and tell us what you're working on?
My name is Gladys Kamasanyu. I'm from Uganda in Africa. I am a chief magistrate of the Uganda Wildlife Court, the only specialized wildlife court currently in Africa, which was established by the Uganda government in the year 2017 and came about because of so much outcry from stakeholders due to delayed trials of wildlife cases, courts giving little priority to these cases, courts awarding non-deterrent sentences that meant nothing after convictions and lengthy trials. So I am glad to be on a day-to-day basis adjudicating over cases that have to do with wild animals, their habitats, the fish, all those that cannot speak for themselves. And I'm able to give decisions on their behalf. And I'm a founder of a 501c3 nonprofit called Help African Animals, which raises awareness about animal protection, the laws protecting animals, and penalties for violation of the laws. My NGO also does court monitoring. It goes out in court and finds out data about wildlife cases, which kind of species more in the courtrooms, meaning which ones are traffickers interested in so much. Is it the ivory? Is it the pangolin scales? Is it hippo teeth? What is it? And then who are these actual offenders who are coming down to Uganda, to Africa, to traffic in this? How long do courts take to hear these ones and determine them? And then which kind of penalties are we getting? Do they make sense at all? And where is the problem? What can we do?
Thank you so much, Gladys. Thank you. Kristen, do you want to?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Justin, and to everyone at the Brooks Institute. I'm Kristen Stildt. I'm a Harvard Law professor and faculty director of our newly endowed and renamed Brooks McCormick Jr. Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard Law School. And in addition to being a lawyer, and I practiced for some years in a corporate law firm, and I spoke about that last night a little bit, and left that to get a PhD in Islamic history at Harvard. And I tell you that just to say, by way of background, I kind of have one hand very much in the American legal system, but the other hand is really still in Egypt, where I helped found a series of shelters and various organizations, and participated in different investigations, and I'm still very involved in the work that the Egyptians, the very hard work that the Egyptians there are doing. And so for me, as an American, and many of you are as well, I think giving you an update on American law is not exactly, would maybe not be the best use of my time, because we're all pretty familiar with the poor state of affairs, and waiting for a Supreme Court decision that may undermine to some or to extensive degree the ability of states to regulate farming conditions. But I think what, in my academic capacity, what I want to say is that what I think is really tremendous is the attention now to global animal law and to comparative animal law, and the fact that we're sitting here having this conversation and interacting, because there's no best practices in the world. It's not like there's a country that has best practices, and if we would just adopt it, there are no best practices. There's just ranges of poor practices. And I think we always have to be looking for ideas for better practices, and they can come from anywhere in the world. And this is why I think that these kind of conversations, and more of them, have to continue to take place. And I honestly believe that until you've looked at another legal system, country, culture, language, you do not understand yourself. And so comparative law is a mirror that reflects not just what you see, what you think you see, but what also is really there. And I think the comparative method is just essential for all of us as humans, really in all aspects of our lives. So I'm thrilled that we're talking about this and that there's more interest in this.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Jaya, please.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So I'm Jaya. What I really focus on is helping companies fulfill their cage-free commitments in Asia, and also work with regulators as well as private standards to meet animal welfare benchmark overall in the standard setting. But broadly in today's context, I think this panel sessions, I'm going to be focusing on India. And I guess what's really going well in India is constitutional courts recognizing the lack of states' capacity to do much, especially when it comes to the legislative ability to legislate in terms of animals, and stepping in, using enriched jurisdictions to lay down law wherever they can, or also using writs of mandamus to get delegated legislations through, and from banning cosmetic testing of animals, or to banning import of testing on animals, to many, many other issues, or also even an ad interim prohibition on establishment of new battery cages in India. It's all been done through using the writ of mandamus by constitutional courts. I think that's what's going really well, and courts kind of recognizing that there is a lack of state capacity, or where it exists, there's a huge amount of institutional capture. What's not going well overall has been, and again from an Indian perspective, is this conflict between the legislature and the judiciary, where the judiciary goes ahead, makes one step ahead, and the legislature goes ahead and like overturns it, and then it becomes a tennis ball, like, just like figuring out who kind of gets this one, and to see when it gets settled. And as we speak, a matter is now pending before the Constitutional Bench of the Supreme Court to see this doctrine of whole unnecessary suffering. Who defines what's unnecessary? Is it the court, or is it the legislature, or is it just generally someone? What's also not going well is the animal protection movement being equalized to the growth of Hindu nationalism in India, and how it's almost been seen equivalent to cow protection. I guess like that's not necessarily going well, and mainstreaming that. So broadly, a lot of things going well, a lot of things not going well. But just speaking in the region overall in Asia, just the interest that we are seeing with the millennials on the issue of animal welfare and wanting to volunteer, be it law schools, be it cutting across disciplines, and I think that's really promising, and I guess that's a hope of change in the region overall.
Great, thank you. So I think with the introductions in mind, I mean, the format, as you can see by this beautiful array of furniture, was to have kind of a conversation, and we, hopefully those of you online will be able to just jump in. I'm going to sort of direct questions or prompts to a couple of people, and I might, and then open it to others to respond if you want. But I was going to start, Jaya, with you, and maybe Lynn, if you're open, just off of something that Kristen said. Kristen noted that the problem of animal suffering is unquestionably global, that there's no way to control it in one state or one province, one country, and then imagine that it is not moving elsewhere. And so that raises, of course, the question for all of us of global cooperation. And Lynn and Jaya, I have a sense that both of you are working a lot on efforts to secure global cooperation, or have seen this happen or not happen. And so if you could start maybe a conversation among this group of things that you think are effective examples of global cooperation, or I mean, we could do this in the questions, or pressure, right? I mean, maybe pressure is another form of cooperation, but coercive pressure from one nation or another. And then maybe examples that aren't going well in the cooperative or pressure sense. Lynn, do you want to start?
Thanks, Justin. Perhaps the case study that I can put forward relates to our work on the live animal export trade. Mm-hmm. And I believe that, one of the key areas where we can assist each other is where advocates have had to have a specific focus over many years in a particular area. Obviously, expertise is built as well as evidence, and certainly over the last 20 years, Australia, which I'm not proud of being a leader in the live animal export trade, it's had to be a strong investigative focus of our organisation. In 2018, we managed to secure a ban on the shipment of Australian sheep and cattle to the Middle East during the Middle East summer, as a result of being able to present evidence of sheep literally baking alive in the hull of a vessel as it was arriving into the Middle East. So that was a significant advancement forced by public pressure, and the Kuwaiti importer at that time, and not being able to access animals from Australia, then turned their attention to South Africa. So we were able to work very closely with the NSPCA there, both in terms of providing background briefings, legal support, funding for their legal challenges. We provided evidence and media interviewees to ensure a major media expose in South Africa, which built public opposition. And we've worked closely, consistently, to the point that this year the Kuwaitis have effectively surrendered and said that they won't get sheep from South Africa. We similarly were able to halt the trade from starting from Namibia because of our expertise in the area. In following this trade, we've also then focused on Europe and have had two advocates working there very closely. We're part of Eurogroup to support the work on stopping the live animal export trade. The evidence that we've gathered and information across multiple countries, importing countries, really was foundational to inquiries in the EU Parliament and Commission that looked into the trade. While it still continues, there has been significant advancements that will increase costs, reduce animal suffering, and provide investigative opportunities, essentially to take the next stage and seek to bring it to an end. Similarly, we were able to work with Mercy for Animals in Brazil by providing evidence and background information that enabled their campaign there. So I think that's a good example of where an org has had to have a specific focus and generated expertise, that collaboration can stop what is always probably going to happen, that when you have an outcome in one country with a global issue, they will try to move their focus to another. It's ongoing, but I think this has been a really positive collaboration that we've been able to have through our expertise in this issue.
Thank you so much. Jay?
Yeah, I think on just the global issues, I guess one example is, of course, in the animal testing world, just in the equivalence that needs to be brought in with European Union. And I guess India almost did the ban on repeat testing of generic drugs, or in terms of various toxicology studies, is to kind of have that harmonization with European Union to get market access overall. And I guess what really triggered was the sale ban, saying that you can't really sell, because then that kind of just changes everything, because countries like India obviously want the export market of the Europe overall. But I guess the globalization is a double-edged sword, because it also easily, if not used right, can beat up nationalism, in the sense saying that, oh, well, it's very easy for developed countries to come and then lecture us as to what we need to be doing, whereas this is our country, this is what we need to do. Like, and it's the common rhetoric, for example, of the Indian dairy industry to say that it's the US soy industry which is kind of targeting the Indian dairy industry. In fact, Amul, which is the largest milk cooperative, in one of the defamation cases against an animal activist for posting a video, their largest case was to say that it was somehow the California's almond industry as well as the soy industry, which was like funding all of this to defame Indian dairy industry, which is by far not true at all. So I guess it's a double-edged sword on whether, how do you really use this whole global issue when it comes to countries which kind of are seeing growth of nationalism within. But in terms of like on the corporate side, on like non-state regulation, companies having these cage-free commitments have really been the catalyst of cage-free production in the region, because knowing that the state's not going to act, and like there's a huge amount of institutional capture there, and just getting states to prohibit cages is not an easy task beyond places where possibly the courts can do. And companies just having these global cage-free commitments is something that's helpful. And what's really important is to see that once these companies do make these commitments, how are we able to hold them responsible in their headquarters, be it in the US or in Europe, that they actually do these commitments, and what kind of possible legal liability, or in terms of just risk, that do these companies face if they don't fulfill this commitment, so that they're able to see that and start implementing. I guess that's important. So I would say the whole global work is double-edged, so you could potentially use it to advance, but if used wrong, can start this whole idea of nationalism within countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. Does anybody want to respond to that, either on this final point of the downsides or the upsides, or in general the cooperative efforts they've seen? Yeah, please, Monica, go ahead. Oh, no, yeah.
For wildlife crime, in order to fight together, I have to say that global cooperation, collaboration, and working together is very important, because wildlife knows no border. It's not Kenyan, it's not Ugandan, it's not Zimbabwean, it's not anything. They'll cross today and sleep in Uganda. The following day they will be in Rwanda for lunch. So they're everywhere. And these species are crossing our borders every day. So if we are cooperating, we are collaborating and working together, we are able to smoke out these bad guys who come to finish the wildlife, to traffic them and take them. And the fact that many of the African countries are actually source countries, this is where many of these are got from, and they're heading elsewhere, say in the West, in the Asian regions and everywhere. So the source countries and the consumer countries of these species of wildlife, if they are collaborating and working together, we're able to set out means of finding out who the traffickers are and arresting them before they perhaps succeed in their criminal activities. If we work together, and collaboration will only succeed if we remove mistrusts. We trust one another and are able to open up channels of communication. We're able to work together, and yes, we conserve wildlife.
Thank you. Yeah. Monica Nunez, do you want to go ahead? Kristen?
I do want to add something to what Gladys just mentioned. And I think when we think about borders, we can think about issues of borders within countries and borders across countries. And I think I want to highlight the importance of capacity building and enforcement these policies, because I mean, I remember correctly when Gladys mentioned animals know no boundaries. There's been issues also of conservation within countries where animals will cross borders of national parks, or will cross borders of national parks where hunting is legal or illegal, and it like this internal border completely changes the way in which we see the animal, the way in which we can source and treat the animal as well. But to think about the region that I'm representing today in Latin America, I think the issue of enforcement and capacity building is also something that is, I think, top of our checklist right now. There have been efforts spearheaded by global NGOs like WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, or UNODC, and trying to enforce better conservation across borders. There's conservation corridors that have worked well right now, like the conservation corridor in Central America to protect the monarch butterfly migration range, and the jaguar conservation roadmap, which is currently being implemented across the jaguar distribution range, which will also affect not only jaguars, but also ultimately, as an apex predator, all the species and all the habitats that enable this apex predator to survive. So by thinking about a particular species, a charismatic species, we can also protect some other habitats. However, there have also been issues of illegal activities occurring in these conservation areas, precisely because of the lack of surveillance, precisely because of the lack of enforcement, in which sometimes countries will designate a conservation area as untouchable or an area that has low budget, and therefore will have less surveillance, and there have been issues of illegal logging or illegal mining, or even like coke plantations and other like illegal market sourcing in areas that are designated for wildlife conservation or wildlife corridors. So I think that's kind of like the good and the bad of low enforcement. There's also efforts that I think yet have to land in actual enforceable provisions, such as including some of these charismatic species in the migratory, in 2020, some of these migratory species were included in the Migratory Species Convention, including the jaguar. And it was Latin American countries particularly that spearheaded these efforts. However, even though there's bigger recognition globally for some of these species, we're still yet to see how the local management plans and the local wildlife conservation plans are going to be implemented. Just to say, I think, rounding up my idea, that even though there are currently collaborations globally and across regions that are spearheaded by some global NGOs like WWF, WCS, or UNODC, which are doing short-term positive impact in the conservation of species and habitats and working with local communities, there's still this second layer of capacity building within the country and appropriating within the institutions of the country, including budget, including ensuring that people, not only judges, but mostly park rangers and other legal enforcement officers are also aware of the possible positive and negative consequences of having these designated areas. So I do think we are seeing the very first steps towards better conservation and rights of wildlife, but there is much more to be done when it comes to capacity building of our public officers too.
Thank you. Anybody else want to say something? Chris, please, yeah.
Yeah, just say something quite briefly to pick up on a couple of the other comments. I think the international cooperation is completely essential for all the reasons we've spoken about, and certainly the Egyptian groups I worked with benefited extensively from the collaboration that they had with Lynn's organization, Animals Australia, many years ago. But I also want to say that we have to also keep in mind questions of context, and post-colonial contexts are extremely important as well. And so the Egyptian groups that I worked with, Egypt is a post-colonial country. There's a lot of sensitivities about nationalism, about quote unquote foreign influence that has only grown in recent years, and as well as authenticity as to animal protection. Is it an authentic issue, or is it Western imposed? And here I think it really mimics the human rights debates that are often seen, right? Is this imposed, or is this indigenous, this is authentic, or somewhere else in between? And I hope we'll talk about religion later, but the Egyptian activists, even if they're not terribly pious in their normal lives, will go very far to shore up their legitimacy through religious arguments, because they have them on their side. And you can go into these very conservative bookshops and see books that you wouldn't appreciate the title about women's place and role and such, but then you turn the corner and there's all these books about animal welfare as an Islamic institution, and we did it first, and 1,000 years ago we were taking care of stray dogs, and there is a history that's very strong and powerful, and they are always trying to kind of push that history to the forefront. But of course, the subsequent history is that there were multiple invasions, and Britain basically occupied Egypt, and foreigners can have done some negative things, and there's sensitivities around that. So the collaboration is so important, but the context and whose name gets put out to the public for this issue or that issue, and the subtleties can be extremely crucial to the success of any kind of work. And I think the work that they did with Animals Australia was very successful, because everyone was very attuned to all of those concerns.
That's great. Thank you, Kristen. Yeah, I think you all, unless, to keep moving forward, so we have lots of, oh, please, Anna, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, am I?
Yep,
Yeah.
You're good. Oh, now we lost you. Hold on.
Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to hook on to the globalization as a double-edged sword, as Jahid said. Globalization means, of course, also globalized production of many animal products, and that means that there is competition about also the cheapest products, and animal welfare standards, not inevitably, but often, are costly and raise the production costs, and the animals are the ones, as Lynn said, without voice, or no, Gladys said that, or somebody said it. So that's where the producers will try to save money, and consumers also follow by buying, for example, cheaper products, which are cheap, produced on the backs of animals, and there, for example, the European Union has a certain record of trying to prohibit the importation of animal unfriendly substandard products. And this is not exactly an example of cooperation, what you asked for, but sounds rather like this is going it alone, or lecturing, as Jahid said. You all know the famous seal products case that the European Union banned the importation of seal products, and it justified this by pointing to the public morals of European consumers who don't want to see the seal products on their markets. But there was also a debate about, again, lecturing and disrespecting the indigenous seal hunt, and also disguised protectionism, and of course, in most European countries do not have any seal industry themselves. It was only in Greenland. The outcome of the case, I think, was nevertheless extremely positive, because it was the first time that the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement body accepted that animal welfare comes under the exception, under the heading of public morals, which then allows import prohibitions. And coming back to the cooperation, I think that such prohibitions, if they are somehow tied back to an international standard, for example, standards of the World Health Organization in Paris, then this has also a collaborative element, and therefore that is a strategy which is which is maybe necessary in a globalized industry.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. So I wanted to just ask a question that I know a number of people in the room have worked on or are working on efforts in the United States related to advocates in courtroom. And Monica Nunez was talking about capacity building. And one form of capacity building that Gladys, you already introduced, but that I thought maybe you could speak a bit more about is this idea of how to, at least as it works in Uganda, and then maybe Kristen, maybe you could respond to the idea of this as important or how it fits in. And Gladys, you could also maybe address whether this is, it feels like something that's authentic to the term that Anna used to Uganda. This idea of how do we get animals' interests into court, and one potential way to do so is to have special courts that are focused on animals, a specialized court system, or to have advocates in court who are presumed to be able to speak for animals. Could you speak a little bit about the way that you think that specialized courts, or at least in your experience, advance the status or the sense of justice for animals?
All right. So to start with is, first of all, to build capacity, to educate as much as we can so our people are able to identify crime against animals. Crime against animals is going on unabated in society where we live. Animal suffering is going on, and we don't know. So until we know, that's when we're able to report the crime. Tell the police, tell law enforcers, report a case in court, and it ends in the courtroom. Now, previously, in Uganda, we had a challenge. Actually, for long, Uganda has been a hub, a transit route, a very important transit route for illicit wildlife products. Many traffickers would opt to have Uganda as the best route where they can go through, perhaps have a stopover, repackage, partially process what they've got, and through our airport, through the borders, head to wherever they're going. So this used to happen, and few people knew, others did not know. Now, stakeholders who are involved in wildlife conservation, like the Uganda Wildlife Authority, the National Forestry Authority, the fisheries protection units, so they had this outcry. Crime is going on, and courts are not bothered because animals will not speak. They will not report a case. They will not be with us in the courtrooms. They will not give evidence. A lion, like recently we lost 6 lions in one day. That case is still in court before me. So they won't come and say, oh, you killed my mother. Here I am, I cannot survive. Or you have cleared my habitat, my home is going, the forest is going down every day. Please help. They won't be there. So after realizing that these cases were going on unabated, those which made their way to police stations, it was very difficult for them to actually have a file compiled and be sent to the prosecutors to sanction them to go to court. And if by luck the case got to court, then the priority that it would deserve would not actually be given to it. Either it would be dismissed, it would take so long in a system that by the time the case has been the time the case gets to be concluded, the benefit of prosecuting such an offender is way less than the cost that has been incurred by the prosecution to maintain such a case in court. So having a specialized court, having specialized judicial officers, having specialized prosecutors, and having specialized law enforcers, investigators, and handle these cases, it means you have people who have dedicated their lives, they have dedicated their time, they love what they're doing, they'll give justice to these cases, the cases will be actually reported, they'll be given priority at the police, they won't delay there, they'll be given priority at the prosecution's desk, they'll end up in court, and you have competent judicial officer who has dedicated time and loves what they're doing, They like hearing the cases, and they have the knowledge of what is happening. Because it's one thing having a case before you, but also knowing the impact of such a case, the effect of the crime going on in society, the effect of your own decision, the verdict that you give, the penalty that you give, what does it serve? Does it serve any purpose? So when you have such specialized people in a specialized court, the cases are given priority, they're prioritized. The sentences, the verdicts that are given by courts are uniform. You have timely decisions being given. You have quality decisions being passed by courts. And yes, the result is a stop to wildlife crime. And we all benefit, not just as a country, because wildlife crime is no longer a domestic issue. It's so global. It affects all of us. And to me, I think specialized courts today are the way to go.
Thank you, Les. So, yeah, I mean, Krista, maybe if you could pick up on that theme and you know, there's many goals in what Gladys said, including eradicating wildlife crime, which everybody would like. I mean, one of the questions that I have often in these settings is just how well do the humans do at speaking for the animal, right? So there's like one role of the court might be, we just have a court, right? We have a court or a system that is dedicated to animals, and that in itself sends a message. It sends a signal of the sort of visceral harm that has been done to some animal. But on the other hand, we might say, but what does the animal say? What are they speaking in these courts? I mean, do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I think it's interesting, I mean, from a comparative perspective, which jurisdictions choose to adopt either specialized courts or to adopt other means of enhancing attention to animals, like courtroom advocates or such. And so I guess a question for you, Gladys, which would be interesting, I think, for all of us is, it sounds like the regular courts were not sort of increasing capacity in the regular courts was not an option that was considered possible because there were so many systemic problems, but rather an establishment of a new court specific for wildlife. The idea it would somehow avoid the problems that were seen in the regular courts. And so that's interesting too. Is it because new judicial personnel, people with special training like yourself would be running these cases? Is it because they're getting more prosecutorial power, better investigation resources? And then I guess more generally, I'm assuming, maybe not correctly, that there is not a specialized court for farmed animals or companion animals or aquatic animals, that there was something very important about wildlife in Uganda that made this the priority of choice. And I wonder if you could say more about that.
Okay, so like I said, we had a lot of challenges in the sense that for long our country was considered as a route, a transit route.
Coming from where mostly?
So these were coming from everywhere in the world, especially Africa, in Central Africa. We don't have so many, I would say, elephants. We don't have that huge population, because unfortunately we lost most of them in the 80s. We had a war that had all of them almost die. Our people hunted them, but not for their benefit, because they were mostly used by those who knew the value of the tusks. Mm-hmm. Now, where you see too much elephant ivory being impounded in the country, then it means there's a problem. The traffickers are opting to use your country because either they are able to take advantage of the system, the weak laws, the corrupt system, and every weakness that prevails in the country. And then you have all the species go through, the pangolin scales come through, we don't have so much pangolins in the country, it means they're coming from somewhere. And until we do something here to send a message that, oh, you can no longer pass through Uganda, then you're promoting killing of wildlife in other countries, the neighboring countries where most of these are coming from. And also, you know, when they come in, this also leads to increased poaching of your own wildlife, because whoever is involved may opt, instead of going elsewhere, to look within and poach your own.
But are your defendants mostly Ugandans, or are they individuals, foreign individuals, who are part of the trafficking chain?
Actually, the actual perpetrators are never Ugandans, the actual ones. But unfortunately, the wrong people get to be prosecuted because they're used by the traffickers. The local people, the poor ones who don't know the value of wildlife species, those who unfortunately live in the same ecosystem with the animals, who know where to find whichever animal you talk about, because they live with them. Same environment, they survive with them, so you tell them, I want some scales this evening. They will know where to find a pangolin and have it murdered and provide the scales to you, but they don't know where you're taking them. They don't know the value that they carry. Yes. And then something else that I want to mention is that, you know, unfortunately, wildlife is not well protected. Save for the cows, the goats, the cats that we keep in our homes that have an owner, because up to now, everywhere, they are still property. We attach value that we have in them. They are my property. They can turn them into money anytime I like. So we take trouble to keep them safer. Now, these are surviving elsewhere in the jungle, and many of them die at early ages because there's nobody there. And in the jungle, it's anyway survival for the fittest, say for the animals. But also, because they are open up in the jungle, humans are able to go in and hunt them and kill them. So it means they need more protection. And when we realized that, we thought we needed a dedicated court. And just like we all know by way of our nature as human beings, if you had one case of a murder of a person, another case of killing of lions, and they're all before you, you are a prosecutor or you are a judicial officer, by human instinct, you're going to be so pulled to expedite trial of the murder case of a human being, because you have the relatives coming and crying before you and pushing and saying, we need justice and we're here to testify. We are here to tell court the truth of what happened that day. But now here you have the lion that died, the elephant that died, the crocodile, the pangolin that died, that is nowhere. Her relatives are not in the courtroom. Her babies are not there to cry for justice. So it means if you have these mingled up in the same courtroom, there's a high possibility that the cases where humans are victims will be heard first, and these will take a long time or not be considered at all. So that's why in Uganda, we had to take a very bold decision to have this court established, based in Kampala, but trying all cases of wildlife that are committed everywhere in the country. It's not easy, but we're doing it, and we can do it, all of us. Now, for farmed animals, we are not.
Well, can I ask you a question on that? I know you want to move on, Justin, but you said that you don't often get to the real perpetrator. I think you even said the defendants are the wrong people.
Yes, the actual perpetrator would mean
somewhere else.
That rich person that is paying a lot of money to make sure they get the elephant tusks. Usually they're not even in Africa, unfortunately. They are somewhere in another country.
So can you cooperate with other jurisdictions to identify them?
That's why cooperation is very important. To get to this is not a joke. They are so connected, they know where to go, and they're so determined to beat the system and go untouched.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you, Les. Before we move on, I do want to sort of keep us on schedule so we have time, but a related question, and Jay, you probably are the best to speak to this, although others should jump in. You know, it's not just a rise of specialized courts or the potential for specialized courts, but you could imagine specialized animal bureaucracies, right? And so in India, there's the Animal Welfare Board, I think it is. And I mean, in Colorado, we have a Bureau of Animal Protection. To some, I mean, that might sound like a great idea as opposed to the Department of Agriculture or something like that. Can you talk about what you think about bureaucracies that develop that are specialized to animals? Should we have animal agencies?
Sure. As in, I can also like maybe start off with the specialized courts bit and then move
Sure.
there, because India actually went through the experiments of specialized court and scrapped it, because it's one thing if you're lucky with a judicial officer who's presiding who cares, but there is also a huge risk that you might end up getting a judicial officer who does not care. So because it goes on the district judge's roster allotment, and the justice judge may just say, well, you are today sitting in the specialized court for animal cruelty, and this person just does not care about the issue at all, and then they would just like quickly get through their roster for the day. So I think there is that amount of risk as well, in the sense that if you get lucky with the presiding officer of that particular court who cares about the issue and wants to do this, and that's great. And the other thing that we also started to see was appellate courts in criminal appeal were striking down the orders passed by special courts, because they were like, well, there wasn't an independent application of mind that was being done, because the judge already had made up their mind or had made a public statement about a particular issue or something like that. And I think that's one of the many reasons. So initially what happened was that they said that we're going to appoint special officers, and they called for recruitment, and a lot of people who cared about animal issues were recruited as judicial officers, went through training, and they made them sit on the bench to look at this matter. Then that became a huge issue, because they were like, well, these people are coming into the court and sitting in the bench, already their mind made up, especially with relation to cruelty cases, saying that they're not going to give the custody back to, let's say, the accused. The custody will always be given to an SPCA or something, and so on. And when the criminal revision appeal would happen, the courts would be like, well, it doesn't seem like the judicial officer applied their mind, the custody needs to go back to the accused. And so that kind of happened multiple times. And finally, the National Judicial Academy of India took a choice, saying that it's better to just build capacity of JMFCs, that is Judicial Magistrate First Class, for the first round where any criminal trials go, to build capacity to deal with this issue, draw up very strong bonding SOPs and train them on bonding SOPs, and say that when a matter comes, this is how you're going to deal with, and mostly to do with cruelty issues, and I guess the issue with relation to custody. Wildlife was a different thing, in the sense that India has very strong Wildlife Protection Act, and the special courts were kind of set up, and wildlife was different. I guess even within the special court system, and we are seeing this. And similarly, even with relation to narcotics, when special courts were set, if you have a judge who is super Puritan about the approach of narcotics, and if you have like somebody is caught with like 3 grams of cocaine, and just like sending them, denying bail just because they come with their preconceived notion about what this issue is, and you don't have the choice of randomization that would happen in a normal criminal court, where the roster allotment is random, and so you get that diversity in the orders of the judgment. So I think that's one issue with relation to special courts. The issue with the Animal Welfare Board of India, and I think that's pretty interesting, and I had the fortune or misfortune of serving on the Animal Welfare Board of India for about 6 years, so initially, when the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act was established in India, it was by the Ministry of Agriculture. So Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Husbandry in the federal government. So the animal welfare is on the concurrent list, which means that both the federal government as well as the state governments can pass legislation, as long as the state government legislation is not repugnant to the central government legislation. So that's broadly what the infrastructure is. So it was under the Ministry of Agriculture, and at some point of time, maybe this was in 1960s. By around 1990s, 2000, they saw that there was obvious conflict, because the Ministry of Agriculture, Dairying and Fisheries, they had a mandate of just increasing production. And the Animal Welfare Board of India was just to, for some unknown reason, they couldn't necessarily see that the animal welfare could actually be installed within the growth of the animal agriculture industry in India. And this is when the time when India, from being a milk importing country, became a milk exporting country, became the 3rd largest producers of egg, one of the top producers of fish, and the 2nd largest producers of fish, right after China, one of the largest producers of broilers. So India saw this huge boom in animal agriculture. But the problem came was that they moved it to Ministry of Environment and Forest, and later on they decided, well, it was a social justice issue, so they moved it to Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. But the issue there that came up was that when the Animal Welfare Board of India would issue advisories, the other ministries just didn't follow it. They were like, well, whatever, we won't listen to you, because we'll kind of continue. And what ended up happening was these litigations of Government of India versus Government of India, and a whole lot of it, because the Animal Welfare Board of India would have to go to court and say, well, we passed these advisories, and this is exactly what happened with Jallikattu, which is this whole bullfighting issue, that bull taming issue that happened. The Animal Welfare Board of India said, it is cruel, it's unnecessary, has to be prohibited. The Government of India prohibited it. Then the courts upheld that particular prohibition. Later on, when the Government of India kind of overturned this court order, the order by the Supreme Court through an executive order, the Animal Welfare Board of India sued the Government of India. And it's pretty interesting, right, in the sense that to say, well, you have one Government of India body, a statutory body, suing another ministry saying that what you're doing not right. And the courts get really irritated when you see this Government of India versus Government of India, and you have two government lawyers trying to just shout at each other within the courts. And they said that, and I guess that's the whole problem with the bureaucracy, in the sense that how do you kind of, keep it independent? If you keep it independent, how do you empower within the statutory mechanism so that what these people say other ministries follow? Yeah. But if you kind of integrate them within the animal husbandry, dairying, and fisheries, then there is such huge conflicting interests. So currently, the Animal Welfare Board of India was moved back to the Ministry of Dairying and Fisheries, but now, the Animal Welfare Board of India is kind of stuck because they've made all these orders. For example, they said battery cages are illegal. You can't confine them. They push for slow-growing broilers in terms of just many issues with relation to fish slaughter and so on and so forth. And now they're obviously competing with the interest of the industry. And I guess the broad question is that within an institutional decision-making framework, sadly, the ones that bring in more money have more power. And how do you kind of balance out within that and improve institutional decision-making within bureaucracies? I don't know if that answers your question, but that seems like a really complex question. And the Supreme Court of India set up a dispute resolution mechanism for cases of Government of India versus Government of India. They said that the Chief Secretary of the state, of the country, should decide, but the Chief Secretary is going to decide where the money is. So I think there is that issue overall, and need to figure out if there is a government mechanism, how does that government mechanism have enough weightage to get other departments to listen to what they are saying?
Great. Yeah, we could spend a lot of time on that. I think I'm interested, and maybe others will ask questions of it. Lynn, I think you may have wanted to jump in. I was going to, in the interest of just keeping us moving forward, another topic that I wanted to hear about, although you're welcome, Lynn, if I was correct that you wanted to chime in to sort of refer back to this conversation. I mean, one of the things I wanted to hear from this group about was the idea of transparency. And so in Canada more recently, and in the United States, we've seen anti-transparency laws, ag-gag laws in agriculture and other places. And I'm wondering, Lynn, I think this is something that Animals Australia is quite concerned with and working around with investigations. Like, what do you think is the role of, and I hope the panelists will jump in on this, but what do you think is the role of transparency in reducing animal suffering? What do you think the role of transparency is in, is it the more that we see that the better the laws will become?
I think we'd probably all agree that if the current animal production practices could be viewed by the public each and every day, that they would be very quickly brought to an end. I think with ag-gag, while the industries may have thought that they had a small win there, I think it's completely limited as a win, and that they've failed to focus on the fact that their greatest risk is not embracing reform, because it's in not embracing reform that we're seeing one of the factors, of course, that is increasing the number of people moving to plant-based diets. You know, we've currently got a legal challenge in Australia around our Surveillance Devices Act that has tried to be utilised by industry to stop vision being aired on television. I think one of the things that we've found is, such as the support in journalism, that wherever possible, they will seek to try and find ways to still air vision. But separate to this, is ag-gag impacting on us? I think such has been the brilliant work of investigators across the globe that the majority of legal practices that animals are subjected to worldwide, we now have evidence of, and therefore the challenge of animal advocates is how to consistently and effectively educate, inform and empower people, because one of the great ironies, of course, that we face is that animal cruelty is distressing for people, and so there is a turn-away factor. So I personally, and others may disagree, don't see ag-gag impacting our work at the moment, or attempts in many ways. The attempts by industry to reduce transparency tells the public that they have something to hide. So there's a way of turning the narrative in our favour. So I think, from our perspective, we have the evidence that we need. It's a matter of consistently and effectively getting it into the public domain to change choices. I think we're probably in a stage with our own regulatory paralysis that we're kind of leaping from people supporting current practices, becoming informed, and then moving to plant-based because of the fact that governments are just failing to implement reform.
Anna, do you want to jump in at all and maybe address that and just maybe even zooming out a bit to address the question of transparency and visibility of animal suffering? Is it relevant? Is it necessary? Is it sufficient? What role do you think it plays in promoting reduction or legal changes that benefit animals?
I think that transparency is totally relevant, of course, not sufficient. And there are also studies showing that people, even if they see the animal production, and here Lynn said that everybody would then stop consuming animals. I think that unfortunately that's not the case. There are also people, even if they see, for example, in Denmark, there are like totally transparent slaughterhouses, and people visit, and then afterwards they still eat meat. So, but I think that, and this also ties back to what Gladys said, education. There is really a lot of lack of knowledge, very simple facts. For example, the fact that the cow will give milk only if it has a calf every year, and so that every milk is also bloody. Most people don't know that because they just don't think about it. So these are very simple facts which need to be conveyed. Some years ago, there was a debate about video surveillance in slaughterhouses, and there are, of course, the main counter arguments about business secrecy and also privacy of the workers. And I think there we can lead a legal debate to show that there are justified restrictions, that the laborer's right to privacy can be lawfully limited in order to video things which are not stored then, so that we can argue against these privacy arguments and push for more video surveillance. And the other route is access to information litigation against authorities, for example, with regard to programs like euthanizing stray dogs or so. There have been successful court cases, for example, before the Strasbourg court, journalists using their right to freedom of information in order to get access to documents which they can use.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, Kristen, I know just before the panel we were talking about the example that you didn't know because you weren't here, Anna, but we were talking about dairy, and actually I had raised what I thought was one of the most sort of chilling videos that I've seen from an investigation in a while, which was the animal justice footage showing a dairy calf sort of being removed from her mother. And Kristen was sort of talking about that. Do you want to say a word with it?
Yeah, I think that sometimes we can be in groups like this, we think everyone must know everything. And to your point, Anna, about the dairy cows, I taught farmed animals last week, and we used an article by Catherine Gillespie. Many people probably here know about it. It's Sexualized Violence. I don't know the whole title, but it's essentially a synopsis of her whole book. And so she talks about artificial insemination and, of course, the constant impregnation, the constant removal of the calves from the mothers. And These are, very smart, maybe not worldly, but very smart Harvard Law School students. And they were sitting there with their mouths dropping, like, I had no idea. And one said, how was I so stupid to think that Cal just like lactated for her whole life? Well, yeah, I mean, why would you think that that's just biologically not possible? But they're all really quite stunned. And then several were gender studies majors, and they wondered why in the world hadn't they talked about this in college in their gender studies classes. But to the bigger point, next week, I'm going to go back and say, how many have thought differently about consuming dairy products because that's really the payoff, that's the question. You can be shocked, but then what do you do about it? But to your point, the educational component, you're right, we think everyone should know this, and it is not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, please, Monica Nunes.
Thanks. Yeah, I want to speak up transparency and also bring forward some of the issues that were mentioned in the capacity building block, because I think it's very relevant. Because transparency, we can see transparency as an empathy instrument. Like we will think that by knowing more and relating more to animals, then that will change our consumption. As consumers, it will change our consumption habits, but I also think this is a capacity building issue, because without availability of alternatives, and speaking as a long-term vegetarian as well, like I think the adoption of alternative products, consumers, technologies, industries will only happen not because of empathy, but because of availability of other resources. So on the farming side of things, I think transparency will also only work if there's a coalition behind it to support it. And speaking of coalitions, I also want to think of transparency and technology as an enforcement tool. We were thinking about capacity building, wildlife trafficking, and trans-regional cooperation. And I think capacity building, and this will make sense in a second maybe, is only possible when there's enough resources, enough legal and institutional design, as Jaya mentioned too, and then monitoring for impact, monitoring for clear indicators through coalitions. So I can tell of capacity building gaps too, in how institutional design is made. For example, in Peru, particularly in Latin America, environmental prosecutors, environmental courts, even though they're specific, they're transitory. They're not, because of the institutional resources, budgets, and how you build a career in prosecution, they're not able to recruit people who want to build a career out of that. So even if you build the institution, then you have to put the support in place for that, and put the knowledge in place for that. And I think that technology and the increasingly online trading of wildlife parts and products, and the increasingly online transparent availability of information on how supply chains are done, and I'm thinking of blockchain, I'm thinking of other like transparency initiatives, will probably open up this information not only for consumers to be more like who are interested, or for coalitions who are interested in sharing this information to understand what the actual supply chains entail, but also for prosecutors, if trained correctly, and if institutionally designed to collaborate transregionally correctly also, it will open up the possibility for enforcement of persecuting wildlife crime, wildlife trafficking, but also better welfare standards for animals. And I do think that even though there is a constraint on the impact that empathy may take, and the impact and the care, like the care that, speaking about animal welfare, will have in the general public, I think there is, and this might be relevant, I think, to everyone sitting here, there is a lot of opportunity in coalitions. Because when we're talking about wildlife trade, we're talking about conservation. When we're talking about wildlife trade and habitat protection, we're talking about indigenous people's rights. We're talking about land tenure. We're talking about FPIC free, prior, and informed consent. We're talking about prior consultation and traditional land right, recognition of traditional land rights, which may seem like divorced claims maybe, and the people working on these spheres might not always be talking to each other. Like the animal protection community is not always talking to the prior consultation, like indigenous rights and land titling community. But I think that by building these types of coalitions, we can achieve our mutual goals. Similarly, in the animal farming and animal welfare communities, there is a very important opportunity to join the efforts of climate change and climate mitigation regulation. If we start thinking and prioritizing climate change, and we start implementing roadmaps for methane reduction, we will then inherently be changing animal farming. So if we think about methane, we're thinking about pork welfare. If we think about like methane and deforestation, we're thinking about cattle raising. We're thinking about how we raise cows, how we get beef, so I think there's a lot of potential for coalitions, not only within the animal community, I think as I said in my introduction video, but looking outside, what other groups can we align with, and then together improve action for our common goals.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that it's a nice segue to, as we're getting close to the question and answer. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask explicitly, I mean, you're sort of talking about this cooperation and collaboration, and is the role of international law as such, like international law, right? So some people came, I think, directly from the UNEP, and we have this resolution, and everyone involved, congratulations. I mean, I wanted to ask just what, and maybe, Anna very quickly, but everyone could turn to this. What should we think of treaties, of resolutions, of conventions? I mean, should this be a priority? I mean, you work at an international institute. Many of us are just working on domestic issues, and that seems daunting. Should we be shifting emphasis to treaties in your perspective? What is the role of treaties and resolutions in all of this?
I think that a global approach is inevitable for the reasons Jahid said. However, the treaty route is a very slow and cumbersome one, and there have been attempts at reaching animal welfare treaties for decades already. It would have to start definitely with so-called soft law, by declarations, by maybe then reaching a framework agreements, and then a treaty. But I think that at least equally important is the strategic litigation to reach court judgments, which then will lead maybe to an unwritten international principles, which arguably like anti-cruelty norm already exists as an international standard, at least that's arguable. And I think that the most important fields of international law are surely international trade law, second, international conservation law, species conservation, and Monica spoke about coalition building. Species conservation doesn't comprise individual animals' welfare. It's even sometimes antagonist, combating invasive species, killing members of invasive species. But you can also try to see things, recognize people that this can be two sides of the same coin. And the third international law field is now health law. International health aspects, principle of one health, which can be extrapolated to one welfare and maybe even as a one rights paradigm. And I think in the trade law area, the EU is trying to do a lot, not necessarily for empathy reasons, but because it wants a global level playing field for its products.
It's really helpful. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Kristen or others, do you want to jump in? I mean, one of the things that I heard that was quite surprising maybe to many people is, it's not conservation law that you would prioritize, but that you would actually say, well, the trade law is the most important. I mean, Kristen or others, do you want to say anything about that? Or do you
Yeah, well, I'll say that, again, to use the human rights equivalent, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born out of a moment of great, of wide-scale agreement about what had been wrong about World War II. There was a fair, strong consensus. And despite the fact that COVID people thought maybe this would be the moment, I still don't think we're in the moment where there's the potential for some coming together around the general principles or specifics for an international treaty. And the evidence of that is if we look at the organizations we do have, like the World Animal Health Organization, recently failed to adopt a standard for hens. Right? And so if the institutions we currently have are struggling with what we might think are very basic welfare standards, to me, we need to focus on getting the right results through the World Animal Health Organization, through the WTO, and you referred to the seal case, and we may see a battery cage case coming at some point in the future from the WTO. Use those institutions and get the right results and keep building towards that, rather than try to jump in from the top. Right now, I think with some kind of treaty, I don't think that's going to be possible, and maybe not even helpful. We just aren't in a human rights moment as we might have seen for the founding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which for me is often a good point of reference. And there's a great book, A World Made Anew by Marianne Glendon, that talks about the individuals and the countries who came together. And I just don't think we're there at this point.
That's great. Well, I almost want to open it up to questions, so we have plenty of time. Lynn, I might ask you one last question just to sorry?
Like culture, religion.
Yeah, exactly. Lynn, one question that sort of comes from the sort of human rights framework that Kristen was just invoking. I mean, Monica Nunez has referenced a couple times the relevance of indigenous culture and indigenous traditions around animal protection. I wonder, in your advocacy, what do you think of the human rights model, and where do you situate yourself and your organization in terms of being universalist or relativist? And when we're thinking about cultures and traditions that are perhaps marginalized, how do you and your advocacy change depending on the type of practice that is being undertaken, whether it's indigenous whaling or any other type practice? I mean, Animals Australia is sort of out there in front on some of those issues, I think.
Perhaps the most relevant one for me to talk about, considering my own work in the Middle East and in Egypt, relates to religion and culture of treatment of animals across that region. And, I think for a start, one needs to deeply understand, and Kristen's obviously the expert in this area, but from my own experience in going in the majority of slaughterhouses across the Middle East and livestock markets, religious principles were not being complied with in any way. In fact, religion was often being used as an excuse not to change, whereas it was simply familiarity with current practices that was maintaining them. My work in Jordan with the Princess Alia Foundation led to stunning being agreed to as halal in their major abattoir there. And what I discovered through that process was how workers were actually appreciative of working in an environment that was less risky for them. So, I think for me, culture evolves. Humans are meant to evolve. My experience also across the Middle East and in Egypt has been when families have brought their children to watch ritual slaughter, you will see that the children most of the time will try and hide their faces in the skirts of their mothers. And then in that moment that they're turned around by their parents, that's the moment that they get conditioned to believe that those practices are acceptable. So I think we've got a lot of work as a movement to do in terms of creating generational change and capturing those kids before they get programmed to think differently. So we have been very sensitive in terms of issues around religion and culture, but I've always been able to find common ground based on common values, because across religions and cultures, still things like kindness, humane treatment, I've always been able to mount arguments that what's in the interest of animals is in the interest of humans. So rather than being divisive, I think that there is a way to advocate that is in the interests of all, that is embraced by people no matter which country.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that directly. I mean, before I open it up to questions, I mean, Monica Nunez, if you want to. I mean, I think many people would agree with what Lynn said, but we might also say that even if the advocates frame it in a way that we may agree that is non-divisive, in the modern political climate, it will be used in a divisive way. It will be used to sort of demonize some groups. We will say, this is the nature of these people. I mean, do you think that that's a problem, or what do you how do you reflect on what Lynn just said?
I can let Anna. She had her hand raised. Really? Okay, I'm still kind of building my my ideas, but something that really struck me that I think was a powerful phrase that Lynn said was religion is an excuse not to change. And I think of religion, and I was thinking of talking about that earlier on the religion question, because mostly one of the questions that you sent us asked about what other countries do you think influence your countries or your regions or your region's treatment of animals. And I was going to talk about Spain. And in previous conversations with some of you here, I've talked about like the role that colonialism has on currently how in Latin America and Peru particularly, we see animals, we make distinctions about different uses that are culturally appropriate or culturally defended, and that for example, like bull racing and like cockfighting are some of the activities that were adopted through colonialism from Spain, and they're currently still defended as an exception to animal welfare in our laws. And I think that's very powerful because it's religion ultimately, and this Christian way or interpretation of being stewards of the earth, not as stewards of conserving the earth, but stewards as in dominating the earth and having the earth resources here to service. And I think that's a very colonialistic view that influences how Latin America sees its relationship to nature, to animals, and it's a way that is actually still in our laws as protecting that view of governing the earth rather than seeing ourselves as a part of it. So what I do think that we can learn from indigenous communities, at least indigenous communities in the Andean Amazon, that are the ones that I'm more aware of, but I also know that some like Confucianism and some Taoism and some Asian traditional cultures view themselves as the same, have more of a biocentric approach. And I think that's a different way of achieving balance and understanding that nature and individuals in nature, such as non-human animals, also have agency, as we have agency to steward the resources of the earth. And I think that is there's a different approach, that is a different management approach and principle that could ensure better conservation and better balance in how we steward resources. But it's also, and I don't want to fall into the romanticizing of indigenous communities and principles. Yeah, just to say that, because it's probably where you're like, oh yeah, she's just romanticizing this essentialism of what like indigenous culture and biocentrism is, because as everything and every other institution, this relationship to the earth for all of us has also been transformed. It's also been transformed by colonialism, by scarcity, by climate change. It's transformed by like cultural influences. So not to say that pure and romanticized vision like necessarily exists anywhere, but it is a principle that still rules some communities' approach to nature, and that is not recognized in many of our legal institutions, and that could very much serve how we view our legal institutions of animal welfare and animal conservation moving forward. So I do also, going back to what Kristen said at the start, it's not like there's one country that's doing everything well, is that there's different ranges of poor management and poor institutional design, and there's something to learn in each one of them. So I'm not trying to romanticize or say that there's this purity that we should follow necessarily, but there are lessons to be learned that could help us, I think, through a decolonization lens, rebuild authentic institutions that could help us move forward, us and non-human animals communities move forward within our country. So that's, I think, broadly something that we could very much talk about for hours.
For sure. Thank you. I mean, Kristen, if people want to get their questions ready, why don't we do that? I mean, Kristen, well, people are standing up to the microphone. If you want to just go. All right. Yeah, we'll open it up to questions now. And Tim is standing in the back with a microphone. I see. But please feel free. You can direct them to any particular person on the panel, or you can ask it more generally.
Form a queue back here.
Good Harvard representation.
Hi, I've got a quick question for Gladys. You mentioned that in addition to adjudicating these cases, you also have your own animal protection nonprofit, which is great because it avoids the problems of the Indian experiment of judges not caring. But in some places, that might open you up to allegations of bias or conflict from the opponents, the people on either side. So how do you navigate that in Uganda?
Can you please repeat your question?
Yeah, so in addition to being a judge, you also said you have your own animal protection organization. So in some places people might challenge that judge's bias or feelings if they're so out in the open about feeling strongly about the subject matter in that way. So how do you navigate that there?
Okay, so I don't run the NGO at all.
Oh, okay.
I don't. I'm not the CEO, I'm not anything, but I'm a founder. It was my brainchild. I came about it, I set it up, I registered it in the US, I registered it in Uganda. It has different people running it, and I am nowhere at all.
Great, okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Catherine Meyer. I'm the director of the Animal Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School. And prior to coming to Harvard, I had a private practice for many years, and one of the areas that I worked in was trying to enforce the Endangered Species Act. And I guess this question is really for Gladys also, and Monica, maybe? Because one of the recurring themes, and one of the problems which Gladys, you got into, which was so important, is poverty. And when you're talking about the local people in these countries that have these beautiful natural resources that rich people in other countries want to kill and take home with them as trophies, it's really hard for those people to ignore the money that's being offered to them to go out and find these species for the wildlife trade. And so I know there's this wonderful program in Kenya. I wanted to ask you if you know about it and if there are other opportunities for this, called the Lion Guardians, where they are now, it's a foundation that is now actually giving money to the Maasai warriors who used to go out and actually kill the lions to now protect the lions from poachers. And it's a wonderful program, and it gives them pride in protecting the natural resources as opposed to killing them. And I think, obviously, doing something about poverty in these range countries, whatever we can do to sort of shift how they view the natural resources and want to protect them and perhaps get compensated for that versus killing them, I think that would be extremely advantageous. And the related question is, I wanted to know your thoughts about the argument that we encounter many times in this country when our government is giving a permit to someone to import a trophy of an exotic species, for example, and the argument is, and often the winning argument with our government is, that allowing the importation of the animal is going to enhance the survival of the species, which is the test under the Endangered Species Act, because the hunters are paying huge amounts of money to the local communities for the privilege of killing that animal, and that money in turn is then using to conserve the species. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about both of those sort of related issues.
Thank you. Actually, I should let you know how heartbreaking it is when you have to try a poor guy, convict them, and sentence them to a very harsh penalty because the law says so. In Uganda, currently we have probably one of the super laws that provides for very deterrent penalties for possession of wildlife species. It's a 2019 law, very brand new. It's currently what we have. It repealed our old law which provided for very weak sentences. But the challenge is the work we're doing as courts. When we have these poor people who are paid by the rich poachers to go in and find the poor animals, kill them for them, bring the trophies to them, but unfortunately, before they hand over the trophies, they're the ones who were arrested. They're the ones who were arrested in the game parks, shooting the animals. They have the guns, poor policemen who carry the guns. They are enticed by these small monies. They go into the parks, they kill the animals. The poor local people have small bicycles, have small motorcycles. They help in moving these contrabands from one point to another. These border crossings of wildlife species from one border to another, entering countries and out, are done by local people. The biggest challenge has been, yes, poverty, but also lack of awareness about the fact that this is criminal. Going into the park and killing an animal is criminal, and should you be convicted, the Uganda Wildlife Act says you suffer life imprisonment. Too big, but yet it's real. It's so sad that the rich traffickers actually usually are not arrested because they're nowhere near the illegal species. The illicit wildlife trophies move without their participation, without their involvement. I have had worst cases where you even ask this poor convict to tell you where he was taking this huge consignment of elephant ivory. Ivory is very, very heavy. And then you ask him, where were you taking it? And then says, I don't know. Someone just phoned me somewhere at a stage in my area where I live and said, carry this sack to the next town. And they paid me this, and then I had to do that. They told me I was going to meet someone else there, dressed like this and that, and a handover. I didn't know what I was carrying. That's how bad it is. So what we are doing, like now my NGO, for me, from this exposure in the courtroom and finding out that the actual problem is actually lack of awareness. Let's raise awareness. Let how people know what they're doing. Let them even know the value of wildlife. Do they benefit from keeping wildlife alive, the wildlife they live with? Do they know that by letting it survive every day, they benefit? Let them know that. Our Wildlife Act actually provides for that. The tourists who come to Uganda to see these beautiful creatures pay money to the government. So 20% of that money is paid to the local people where the game park is. Why? Because we know these animals do not just stay in the park. Our parks are not fenced, and then communities border it. So actually animals come out and stray onto people's land. They eat their crops, they kill them. So all this suffering that they encounter, let the 20% go to them. So they should know, when we have wildlife survive with us, we will benefit as a community, but also as a country. But also there are these natural benefits of having wildlife with us in the ecosystem. So we are doing that awareness and to see that we work with them. And then we also have programs that are run by the Uganda Wildlife Authority, the main agency that is in charge of conservation of wildlife. Programs which are converting poachers involving them into conservation. Poachers are turned into patrolmen, they're turned into rangers, they are helping the mother agency because they know more about the animals. They live with them, they've worked in them, though illegally, Now they're being turned into good men and women who are going to provide information about wrongdoers, but also help in actual protection or conservation of the animals. Trophy hunting is real and so sad that African countries actually do allow trophy hunting. Our governments give permits to tourists who want to kill our animals just for pleasure. And then they come back with these trophies. It's very, very sad. But today some countries are taking a bold step, which is very hard, again, because of poverty and the fact that most African countries actually, why more protection, and I will say, is given to some animals and not to others. We still have animals, wild animals, that actually have no sort of protection because we perhaps believe we don't benefit so much from them. So those ones go unprotected. And when you kill them, you're not committing an offense. Isn't that sad? So trophy hunting is bad, and we can only stop it if we work together. Where the trophies are coming, the consumers of those trophies, those who don't even eat them but just take pride in seeing a lion down and they're taking photos, but they don't know what it means to take out one single lion from the ecosystem. So we can only fight together to stop it. The source countries and the consuming countries working together. That's the only way of perhaps managing. If this were where they're coming, you say, you will not return with your trophy, then a hunter will not find reason to go to Africa to kill, even though African countries will still be allowing hunting of some animals, because they don't allow all. Some of them, but all of which we need alive.
Yeah, Monica Nunes.
Hi, yeah, I mean, I think the issue of poverty is a big one, and it's the one that we could say affects governance at different levels. And I think I want to talk about like 3 different levels of poverty, and not necessarily only the people on the land managing for trophy hunting, but also thinking of allocation of resources. When a country, particularly in developing countries, there's so many needs for resources against not only animal welfare, but to improve welfare of humans, to improve education, health, and other programs. So first of all, I think the issue of poverty affects governance of animals, either wildlife, industrial, or domestic animals, because some of the resources that could be allocated are actually prioritized to other issues. And this is something that we talked about in capacity building too, is like the country's brightest and the countries more committed are probably going to try and to work on different issues and not necessarily animal welfare. So the way a country sees the need for resources might influence their allocation, but also might influence the policies that it passes for producing. And this is something that I came across when I was looking at deforestation in the Brazilian Cerrado and the policies that the Bolsonaro government has enacted that actually made it easier to cut forests in order to carry out like crops or animal agriculture. And this is the poverty side. This price, this global competition for cheaper resources, and this price war, and this this self-conception of poverty influences the sourcing of supply chains, and particularly thinking of the Brazilian Cerrado and thinking about deforestation. I was looking at some at the research from Trace, which has been tracing the link between forest loss and beef, and where in the world the demand comes from, and it found out that that the supply chain requirements from some countries or regions actually influence the way, this is no surprise, but actually influence the way in which land is managed. And particularly thinking of animal welfare and thinking about my other side, which is sustainability of Chinese investments, it found out that the sourcing standards for China and Hong Kong, for example, if they were switched, if the standards for sourcing beef from developing countries with big demands such as China and Hong Kong would be changed to include animal welfare and different procedures in animal slaughtering, that would indirectly have an effect on how land is managed, how cattle is raised, and ultimately conservation of the ecosystems in which these products are produced. So a second layer of poverty, I would say, is also South-South cooperation and this battle in the market for cheaper production that also that puts the weight not only on animals, but also on the ecosystems and the people that are directly or indirectly affected. I'm thinking about indigenous communities displacement in the Brazilian Cerrado and the Amazon, for example. So again, coalitions and supply chains, I think, make an appearance when we're thinking about poverty and pricing, not only locally and, putting the burden on, and this is, I think, the last layer of poverty that I was thinking of, putting the burden of protection only in local communities and their relationship to the land and their relationship to the animals is unfair. There has been many discourses around COVID, but one of the discourses around COVID was around the consumption of bushmeat and subsistence hunting and how that might be related to the sourcing of infectious diseases. But it has not been proven, and particularly in my research, there is no link between bushmeat consumption and the emergence of zoonotic diseases. There's more of a link. There's more of a link between capitalism, like structured production, and zoonotic diseases than there is around bushmeat and local consumption. So, however, I think this discourse has affected.
Monica, not to cut you off. I mean, you can finish this point, but we do have 4 people in line, so I just want to.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No problem.
I just want to say that this discourse has affected the way we see local consumption, and the way local consumption has also been deterred by people on the ground and prosecution of crimes, because it's easier to think about the one person, as Gladys said, that caught the jaguar than to think about dismantling the whole wildlife trafficking global scheme. So I think poverty, closing the circle, allocation of resources to prosecute globally wildlife trafficking schemes would definitely be more expensive than it is to just have prosecutors go after the local communities that might be doing the hunting. So
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. All right, please. Yeah, we have 4 more questions. We'll try to keep our answers quite brief, but go ahead.
I'd like to return to the issue of transparency and education that was mentioned. It struck me that, people can go to a slaughterhouse and then eat meat. And I know people also can spend time with animals and then order them in a restaurant. And so, this idea of education, where, telling people about what happens to dairy cows, it seems to me that there's a disconnect there. If you can watch an animal being slaughtered, how is it that we can expect education about what happens to be as effective as we'd like it to be? So it seems to me that there's that kind of disconnect, and there may be a need to pay attention to the psychology of why that is. As someone who spent a lot of time in education on farmed animals and marine mammals, et cetera, come to the conclusion that education is absolutely necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I want to know, what is that extra ingredient? Thank you.
We might put two questions in together just to keep everyone going. Do you want to ask your question as well? And then whoever wants to respond to Lori can do so, and then we'll also have Nirva.
Sure. I mean,
Thank you.
my question is probably for Kristen and Jaya. In countries where animal law is considered an imported concept of Western influence, those same countries, such as India and apparently Egypt, have historical context for the protection and care of animals. How can we revive that narrative and intercept at this moment when factory farms and the commoditization of animals is gaining prominence? To shift policy, we need a multiple streams approach. What would those multiple streams be that would stand up against these gigantic meat and dairy policy monopolies?
Great, thanks. Those questions actually have some overlap. Do we want to?
Sure. Maybe I could start from the dairy one because it's this common thing in India because people who care about animals, even within the Jain community where they talk about animal welfare all the time, consume dairy. And I guess there is that dissonance to say that if you're not killing an animal, it's okay. And I think that's where I think a fundamental issue is with dairy is people think that as long as the animal is alive, it's okay. I'm not killing the animal. And then you'll say, well, it's not the dairy people, it's the beef people that you need to be focusing on. It's the people who wear leather who are the problem. I'm not a problem because I'm just consuming the milk. And I guess the solution really is, and at least I feel is, cheap, convenient, and tasty alternatives being easily available. I guess like that's basically what is required, and just people having these alternatives that's there, and knowing about the whole abuse system. And I guess, and I think, and there again, it's a problem, right? As in even within the egg laying industry, when we show people pictures of battery cages, they're kind of upset. But then you show them pictures of like male chicks being grounded up, they're super upset. And everybody wants to act on the male chick being grounded up. But in terms of just suffering, male chicks being grounded up is bad, but in comparison to what the egg-laying hen goes through in battery cages, nothing. So in the sense that there's also that issue in the sense that when you really show something that's super shocking and people want to focus on that one particular aspect of super shocking versus just like everything else within that system is so institutionalized, and I don't have the answer on the dairy one. On the second issue of relation to animal welfare being seen as an imported concept, and I guess that's also because, at least speaking from an Indian perspective, the concept of animals as property is something that the common law brought in. Before that, Indian animals were never considered property. In fact, there are stories within Indian mythology where animals were rulers, they owned kingdoms. You had gods who had half animals and half human beings. My name itself, Jayasimha, means a victorious lion who happened to be a ruler of India who was half lion and half human being. So that mythology kind of just existed, and I guess people not necessarily associating this whole thing of cruelty being bad, property and everything being pretty new, and then using these legislations to attack religious practices is what they're seen. For example, when you say, well, animal sacrifice in temples is bad, or when Jallikattu, which is bull taming, is really bad, and then you kind of see, well, we have a fundamental right to religion, then the Constitution provides some sort of duty to be compassionate to living being, the Supreme Court says that that duty is actually the right of the animal, and then you start seeing this conflicting view when you have rights on religion and then right of this particular animal, and the legislation kind of has to find that fine balance in which the religious freedom of people is not necessarily infringed while the rights of the animals are also taken care of. And it's all very complex because one is people's mindset are still not within the common law system. They still are looking at how traditionally these communities were kind of ruled or governed, and then you suddenly have this common law system, and then the use of this particular common law system to abolish some of these practices suddenly gives it a Western outlook. And I guess I don't think there's a solution. To answer Nirva's question, I don't know the answer to this, but it definitely does seem that there's a conflict between what was culture, what is religion, the existence of some of these traditions prior to common law coming in, and then there's like a broad conflict between that.
Thank you. Kristen, do you want to say something?
Really quickly, and then Nirva, we can continue. But I think that if we talk about the Egyptian case, there are multiple stakeholders or interested parties who can put pressure on this, because religion alone or reviving an understanding of religion alone is not enough. And I'll just say quickly what the problem with that is as well. But I mean, for example, there's trade issues. So, the live exports don't send to Egypt if there are egregious violations. There's, the health angle. So street slaughter is very bad for an animal because usually it's a person who hasn't had any slaughter experience. But also it's very unhealthy for individuals. There's the environmental angle, which is starting to get a little more traction. There's poverty alleviation. People in the slaughterhouses have the worst possible jobs. There's infrastructure developments. If your slaughterhouse is just a big open space, you know that there's going to be very poor animal welfare. But what I want to say about religion is that religion and ethics, it can do a lot of work, but it has this other side to it, and that other side has been discussed in the Indian context, which is, and these are about bigger battles of the role of Islam in the state, because it is difficult to say, our animal welfare law should be all religion-based. But I don't want to hear that when it comes to dress or finance or the role of women or other areas or the treatment of minorities. So it is difficult, and I think people are aware of it, to really rely heavy on that. And then what are you asking for in a consistent way? Are you asking for what comes with it? Are you asking for an Islamic state? Because if we look at Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's not as if those are fantastic places for animal welfare either, and they would both claim to have the most religion in the state. So religion can work, but it's also really complicated.
Yeah, and just like make a minor point on that, as in India itself, like as of now, India is going through this huge debate on ban of hijab in primary and secondary schools. So the government of India brought in a law which said that it has to be uniform in every school, and so it basically meant the ban of hijab. And now, when these are now being litigated in court, and I think the question that really comes is that where does the state draw its line? If you're saying that, well, the religion requires like no stunning, the state says you have to stun. The religion requires cockfighting or whatever, then the state says no. But then suddenly when they say if the religion requires hijab and but the state says no, you kind of are stuck saying that where do I say, well now if I say no hijab and support it, that basically means that Muslim women would never be able to attend school. That kind of keeps the Muslim women within the vicious cycle of illiteracy. But you still want to be proposing some sort of advancement on the animal issue. And I guess these conflicting issues also come in even within, I would say, forward-thinking leftists, in the sense to say, which kind of state intervention to curtail religious practice is okay and which kind is not okay. And I guess it's pretty complex that way.
Yeah, and Lori, I would just say to your question about the special, I mean, there are a lot of people, like what is the thing that's missing? There are a lot of people in this room that you could sort of speak to that are thinking about that very issue, right? The failure of transparency. I know that, Leah's here and Cheryl are here and Camille, and you can talk to them about, I don't think the investigations themselves have ever been enough standing alone, and so how do you tie them? So sort of, I'm sure they would welcome that conversation, and then Timothy and Janice and others are sort of looking at things around cognitive dissonance and transparency. So there is some of the expertise in the room, and so that's kind of why we're gathered. I don't think we have the answer here, though, unfortunately. Do we want to take the last two questions together and then answer?
Sure. Actually, my question is around transparency as well. And first of all, I want to thank all the panelists for this really engaging discussion, which I feel like could go on for about 10 hours. But
you feel like it has been?
We've had a lot of investigations around farmed animals as well as animal trafficking, and I think a large percentage of the population is now beginning to understand what happens in slaughterhouses, what intensive animal agriculture is all about, and they are also beginning to understand what the wildlife trade is all about as well, too. What I'm not seeing is the overlap. So where I live, near Point Reyes National Seashore, Harvard Law Clinic recently sued National Park Services about the tule elk that are dying at the hands of the dairies on our national lands. This is a case that I've found among neighbors who are ranchers and non-ranchers, but I live in a ranching community, where the community is in an uproar against the ranchers for the first time. And they're actually, people have come up to me and they've appreciated what Harvard Law Clinic has done. There's been write-ups about it in local papers, and they're finally beginning to make that connection between wildlife and animal agriculture.
Great.
Whenever I tell anyone about what the U.S. Wildlife Services is doing to kill wildlife in order to make way for ranching, people are aghast. 1 million animals were killed last year on taxpayer dollars in order to make way for grazing land. And these are the kind of things that I find drops jaws. So I'm wondering, why are we not doing more to create transparency around the connection between wildlife and animal agriculture?
Great question. Thank you. Delcy.
Thank you. Delcy Winders, Animal Law and Policy Institute at Vermont Law School. And one of the things we're doing at the Institute is working with our National Center on Restorative Justice to increase discourse around restorative justice and animal law. And I feel like so many of the themes that were touched on today, I mean, Gladys's discussion of prosecuting low-level offenders, the discussion of poverty, of indigenous approaches is pointing us towards restorative justice, but I haven't heard it mentioned. And in the US, those discussions are just starting to happen, thanks in large part to Justin and Lori Gruen's scholarship. And I'm hoping to hear that other countries are working in this space and that we can learn from them, but I haven't heard that yet.
Thanks, Delcy. Somebody want to jump in? Anybody want to start with, who wants to take Miyoko's? Yeah, Monica Nunes, please.
Yeah, I can try to be very brief, but to the first question, I think the link between animal farming and wildlife and displacing wildlife is not being made culturally because they are not part necessarily of the same like legal structure. And we talked about this too, and I think it is the way that we structure property law that is, and property law is far away from wildlife law, and property law is far away from farming sometimes, at least in the communities that work on it. So making the link is not direct, and the fact that animal farming and animals are used to occupy more land and by that harming wildlife, I think is not being seen as a direct competition between one kind of animal and the other that is driven by basically the market, or that is driven by the wanting to produce more. So I would say that that's the reason to the first question why we're not seeing it directly, even though it's there's a clearly direct and like causal link between choosing one kind of animal and not choosing the other kind of like conservation and wildlife. But I would love to hear more about what's happening in other communities, and not necessarily in the Amazon. And on the point of restorative justice, I did mention indigenous communities, and I mentioned tenure, and I was thinking, of course, in the Andean Amazon communities more likely. But before coming to this panel, I was also thinking about how so many of the current movements that are gaining traction in the U.S., such as the land acknowledgements and land back, particularly the land back movement, I think will also indirectly affect habitats and will affect animal management, wildlife restoration. And I think, again, there is a huge opportunity and potential for coalitions and for strengthening the groups of people that are working towards a very similar goal, even though we're trying to get there through different mechanisms, as restoring land or recognizing tenure on indigenous communities, and on the other side, looking at conservation. There are natural allies, and our different communities should start talking to each other more.
That's great. Thank you. Gladys, do you want to?
Looking at the question of why wildlife and agricultural animals are not taken care of together or same way, where I am coming from, again, I'll answer it from my perspective of an African or Ugandan at that. So there's so much that we attach to wildlife, and that's why I'll say in Africa, many of our countries do not even have the Animal Welfare Acts. My country doesn't have one. We have an anti-cruelty law which is very old. It was enacted by colonialists. And I can assure you, when they left with it, because it's not enforced. It's not to say that there's no cruelty that is being meted out on animals. There's too much of it. Too much of it, but we have an old forgotten law whose penalties are too irrelevant. If you have a punishment of a fine of $1, then that's no punishment. Going ahead to prosecute an offender in such a law will be in vain, because there will be no benefit at all. So we have left agricultural animals to be cared for by their owners, whose property they are. And they do anything they like with the animals, taking in mind the benefit they accrue from them. We don't have factory farms yet where I am coming from, so we still have animals go out on their own and come back in the evening. But I'm sure in some years to come, whatever is happening here and elsewhere is going to reach there. It will get there. So wildlife, why is it given priority and why is it given more protection? Again, it is because of the human, I don't want to call it greed, the benefit we get from it. There's so much money that comes with it when we have so many lions, the beautiful rhinos, the hippos, because many of us want to go there and look at them. We pay so much to see them, so their survival brings a lot of money to us. And also the belief that wild animals are given not good protection because there's nobody there to take care of them. They are living by themselves. If they survive from other animals, because they must, the chain has to be natural, one survival and another like that. So whichever survives, again, there are other humans who may come against it. So that's why you have some laws in place setting bad or huge penalties for offending those laws than the other side of animals in agriculture, where actually in some countries there are no laws whatsoever. In mine, we have the law, but it's not enforced. So we have left them to be taken care of by their owners. Where you go and injure an animal, we have had worst cases of cruelty where one gets so annoyed because another's cows have strayed into their farm, eaten all the food, and they'll get pangas and cut all the legs of the cows or the goats and injure them so badly. So that's too much cruelty, for heaven's sake, which should be prosecuted as cruelty. But you don't have that one. You'll instead have a different case filed in court under the penal code, which is called injuring animal. And who brings that? The animal owner. If they are asking for damages, it's their damages. It's not to focus on the suffering that was occasioned to the animal. So that's the position, and it's not fair.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to keep you all in the room any longer while the sun is out. I mean, lunch is going to be in 15 or 20 minutes. I want to thank the panel. I hope you'll join me in thanking them. Thank you for joining us from around the world. And Gladys, Kristen, and Jaya, thank you here. Thank you all very much. We will continue these conversations throughout the day. Thank you.